A single plate, a sliver of silvered copper blemished at the edges, its mirror scarred by handling, sat under a lamplight and refused to lie. In the blurred, high-contrast world of the early daguerreotype, faces often softened or stretched. Portraits were more suggestion than exactitude, yet this plate returned a likeness so exact that it did not feel like suggestion at all. Two young men, posed separately but caught together in the same accidental exposure, shared a line of bone and an eye set so particular it read like proof. The same straight nose, the same stubborn jaw, the same grey-green eyes that, when compared side by side, made denial brittle and useless. One of those men was dressed as privilege, linen collar, clean cuffs, the assured posture of a son being prepared for the law. The other bore the texture of toil in his hands and the lean of a man who rose with the fields. Both gazed forward. Both looked like kin. How one photograph revealed the slave's hidden identity. Prepare to be shocked. That is not hyperbole. At Belle Reve in the tidewater of Virginia, a single accidental image would do what many words, rumors, and half-remembered glimpses had failed to accomplish. It would force a small, refined world to look at what it had long preferred to look away from. Belle Reve in the summer of 1854 presented the picture the world expects from a prosperous plantation. A long gravel drive opened onto a pillared portico, magnolias shaded a lawn mowed close by enslaved hands, silver gleamed in the dining room, and family portraits hung as reminders of lineage and order. Inward, the house was arranged to show who belonged and who did not, polished floors for guests, a study for papers and planning, a parlor for the careful cultivation of social standing. The ledger in Alistair Dandridge's study listed names and numbers with clean handwriting, not people but entries. It was efficient. It was how the Dandridges kept their world small and comprehensible. Outside that ordered world, there were quarters where the light was different and the conversations quieter. Ara's cabin was not a place photographed in the albums the Dandridges kept. It had no silver, no carved chair rails. It had a kettle, a thin blanket, a wooden stool. Ara moved through that space with a restraint born of perpetual calculation. She kept her head down not because she accepted the injustice that defined her life, but because to survive, she could not afford the wrong glance at the wrong time. Her son Samuel grew into a body that seemed to remember a promise he had never been given. Broad shoulders, a weary patience. People in the quarters noticed the resemblance long before they spoke it loud enough for the house to hear. A whisper here, a knowing look there, but whispers do not carry as far as printed paper, and knowing looks are not evidence. Alistair Dandridge, the master of Belle Reve, had the qualities expected of his class. A clean line of propriety, a facility for making accounts add up, and the private, unrevealed inclinations of any man whose power over others was near absolute. His wife, Evelyn, filed her life into the small rituals of household management. She kept the china and the calendar, the guest lists and the social eyes. Catherine, Alistair's unmarried sister, embroidered the household's lore into conversation. A woman of gossipy force who would not permit an unshaped scandal to confuse the family's standing. Thomas, the legitimate son, read law books and practiced the gestures of a future gentleman. Measured phrases, polite attention. He was being made respectable, and the future, marriage, prospects, ambitions, had been mapped for him by others long before he could claim it as his own. And then there was Silas Croft, who came down the road with a wagon full of plate and varnish, the travelling daguerreotypist. He was, in some respects, incidental to the Dandridges' world, a craftsman whose business depended on the vanity of families and the curiosity of townspeople. He carried with him the smell that belonged to his trade, iodine and mercury, the sharp chemical tang of a process that promised truth in a small, ambitious pocket. His camera was a box on wheels. His dark room was a tent stitched into the side of his wagon. He needed light and he needed a subject willing to sit still, and for a fee he would give you an image your neighbors could not deny. Daguerreotypes were a peculiar kind of magic. A sheet of silver-plated copper was sensitized with iodine to catch an invisible impression in the camera. After exposure, the plate was developed with mercury vapor and then fixed. The image was direct and singular. No negative, no multiple prints unless a printer made copies from a reproduction. The process required steadiness, a certain ritual, Coat, wait, expose, develop, fix. It was a science of patience and chemical experiments. The images revealed more than a painter's rendering might. The lights and the shadows fall where the lens decrees they must, and small, truthful details the sitter might prefer to hide, scar tissue, a chin's exact angle, the simmer of an eye, survive the ordeal. Silas set up his apparatus at Bellerive on a humid afternoon, when the magnolias smelled of heavy blossom, and the house hummed faintly with domestic work. He had been doing such work their whole trade season, capturing likenesses for gentry and merchant alike. People were drawn to daguerreotypes because they wanted a proof of themselves, a severe "are you really that handsome?" or that composure. For the Dandridges, it was ornamental, a necessity of social life. For the enslaved, daguerreotypes were complicated. The technical barrier and the social norms meant that few servants would be asked into the parlor for the honor of a portrait. Yet servants and houseworkers were sometimes proximate enough to a portrait process to be noticed, a hand on a shoulder, a glance caught in a doorway. It is in those marginal spaces that accidents happen. The accident began, strictly speaking, as a test. Silas needed to focus, to determine exposure, to set the plates. Thomas, impatient or curious, had offered himself as a ready model. Samuel, returning briefly from the fields to fetch something from the house, crossed the path. Perhaps he paused. Perhaps he watched the carriage wheels. Perhaps he was adjusting a hat. The camera's lens, slow and indifferent, took them both in one arresting frame. In the resulting plate, the young men overlapped not entirely but enough. The profile of one fell against the shoulders of the other. An angle of chin matched a turn of cheek. It read like inheritance. When Silas developed the plate in the dim interior of his wagon, the mercury left a sheen that made the image appear almost alive. The way the metal caught light created eyes that seemed to look back. He had seen many faces in his trade. He had handled more likenesses than he could name. But faces that insist upon themselves, that insistence like a melody lodged in your bones, have a way of arresting a man. He held the plate and felt the soft vibration of something like dread or responsibility. He did not know the words for it. He turned the plate and held it to the lamp. Both young men's eyes glinted. For the first time in that mercantile life, a client's image felt like an accusation. Silas could have hidden it. He could have scraped the silver and declared the plate a failed trial. He might have gone on his way. He did not. He did something else. He kept it. He wrapped the fragile plate in oilcloth and tucked it in his case with his chemicals. There are many plausible motives one can imagine. Professional curiosity, a craftsman's aesthetic. But his actions mattered more than any motive we might ascribe. He took the plate away from Bellerive. Word in the shadowed economy of a plantation travels differently than in a town. A rumor needs witnesses. A printed plate is proof. The Dandridges had long managed contradictions in quiet ways, strategic disclaimers, discreet relocations, a ledger entry that smoothed the discrepancy of a life. The portrait refused those mechanisms. It would not behave like a rumor. It would not be put back on the shelf with the silverware. Before the plate reached the press, before it became an emblem of scandal, there were the small human stitches in the fabric of Bellerive. Ara tended to the study's hearth without entering the study. She had known Alistair's habits. She had borne witness to appropriation and to broken private promises. The transcript of her life, the facts that can be told without dressing them in the heat of lit narrative, says this plainly. Ara was assaulted. She bore a child. That child, Samuel, grew up in a world that tried, by law and by custom, to render his very blood unsayable. To speak such a thing aloud in polite company was a social hazard. Yet in the quarters it was a quiet fact, the kind of detail that shaped decisions without ever entering the public ledger. Those who observed the likeness between Samuel and Thomas often chalked it up to imagination. People see what they expect to see. The advantage of a photograph is precisely that it does not accommodate expectation. It corrects it. Thomas, for his part, was not a character easily summarized as a hero or a villain. He was young, a law student with the future stitched onto him by an older generation. He was raised in habits of deference and supremacy. He had learned to accept a world arranged as it was. But there are moments in a life when the neat fabric of upbringing frays at the edges, when a fact that cannot be folded back in forces you to choose whether to stitch along the old seam or to cut and create something new. The plate presented such a moment. There is evidence scattered in letters and recollections of Thomas's private shock when he first saw the printed likenesses that circulated later. He walked the plantation with a weight that did not settle into pre-existing categories. He went to the quarters. He looked. The narrative that follows must reckon with the fact that his interior life changes the story. A son educated for privilege, confronting the human consequence of that privilege, complicates the limits of culpability. Not everyone responded to the plate with conscience. Catherine cornered the problem as a tactical matter. To her, reputation was a currency not unlike currency used in the market. She saw the social damage and wanted it stopped in the simplest way possible. Remove the source, sell the enslaved, send them away, cut the rumor at its root. Her voice in the parlors was practical, sharp, and unforgiving. Evelyn, Alistair's wife, reacted with a different force. Her shame took the form of collapse, not a theatrical faint, but a retreat into a private grief that had no public outlet. Wealth, for Evelyn, had always secured a perimeter around pain. When that perimeter cracked, she discovered that the house did not protect everything. The mechanics of the plate's movement were, to outsiders, a minor cabal of small decisions. Silas carried the plate into Petersburg, where Douglas Webb kept a modest shop that reproduced likenesses for clients, and occasionally for printers. Douglas handled many plates. He knew how a plate could sit in one's hand and make a man's stomach turn. When Silas unwrapped the plate in Douglas's back room, Douglas did not at first understand why the itinerant portraitist looked like a man bearing news, but the image made itself legible in a way that words did not. Douglas held the plate up to the light and felt the hard clarity of resemblance. He made a copy. Douglas Webb's brother Marcus in Philadelphia ran the Liberty Standard, a paper with abolitionist leanings that trafficked in photographs as weapons of argument as much as in pamphlets and polemics. The press was a network. Images and words moved from hand to hand, across the Mason-Dixon as surely as people did. A reproduction, a vein of evidence, could cross the line that whispers could not. Those who believed that sight can convict went to the presses to make the argument visible to those who had the power to act. There is no neat single line connecting the plate at Silas's workbench and the first printed copy in Marcus Webb's paper. Instead, there was a chain of small transfers, a glance at a shop counter, a hurried conversation over coffee, a decision to run an image alongside a story. Each person who touched the image had a choice: to keep it private, to discard it as an ugly thing, to use it as fuel for a cause. The men charged with those choices had varied motives and stakes. Some were moved by conscience, others by the intoxicating potential of a scandal that would sell papers. Their decisions placed the plate into wider circulation, and once out of one private hand and into another, an image takes on a life of its own. It is tempting, when recounting such a chain, to ascribe a single moral arc to the men who moved the plate. The safest narration resists that temptation. Instead, consider the texture of small human decisions: Silas's unwillingness to destroy evidence, Douglas's curiosity that could not unsee what he had seen, Marcus's willingness to publish what the South would perhaps prefer not to have shown. Each of these choices could be described without reducing the actors to parables. People act within constraints and with motives that may be mixed, and the result is still consequential. Back at Belle Reve, the life of daily domesticity went on while the plate started its slow odyssey. The men in the fields bent under a sun that did not know there was a crisis being assembled for the parlors. The house continued to run with its rituals. The dignity that once masked the household's fractures was only skin-deep. The photograph scraped at it, with that particular kind of honesty that photography, more than other media, seemed to claim as its right. The moment of exposure is not only chemical, it is also social. The plate had now become a lever that might pry open those polite doors, not because it was intended to do so, but because it could not be contained. At whatever point Silas saw the plate fully, when the mercury cooled and the image resolved, something in him shifted. Present tense recollection of that instant captures what was quiet and electric about it. He held the plate as if it were a wound. He felt the thinness between seeing and knowing. He might have rationalized that he was a craftsman, that his trade demanded honesty. He might have told himself that the plate was only a curiosity. The plate, however, was not indifferent. Its truth was a small, piercing thing, and once he had it under oilcloth, once he had left Belle-Rive and set a course for Petersburg, the line between private shame and public consequence had begun to draw itself. Silas's wagon rattled down the old road, and as the plantations thinned, the plate sat at the bottom of a case and waited. There are images and there are moments when silence is no longer tenable. This was one of them. The plate could be an object on a shelf. It could be a tool in a fight. The choices of a few men, careful, hesitant, human, decided the plate's fate in ways they could not have anticipated. If this sort of historical investigation is the kind of story you want, subscribe for more. We unpack single objects that changed lives. A photograph moves like a rumor, but with weight. It travels by hand and by print, by gossip and by legal argument. It exposes similarity in a culture obsessed with difference. And when that resemblance is of kin in a world that has forbidden notice of that kinship, the photograph becomes less a portrait than a verdict. Silas arrived at Douglas Webb's shop, with the wagon's dust still in the cracks of his boots. The counter smelled of solvents and newsprint. He unwrapped the oilcloth and set the plate on the velvet. Douglas turned it in the lamplight, and, in the stillness of a room that smelled of toner and metal, both of them took measure of what the image said plainly. The likeness between the two young men did not require argument. It sat in the fulcrum of the photograph, mute and insistent. Douglas did not react with immediate moral certitude. He reacted like a man who had seen a professional curiosity and felt the sudden, particular cold of recognition. He knew how such an image could be used. He had a brother in Philadelphia who believed pictures could be instruments for truth. He also had clients to placate. He had a shop to run. For some men, there is a precise moment when curiosity tips into purpose. For Douglas, that moment arrived precisely when he folded the plate into his hands and caught the flash of the other's eye in the reflected metal. He made a copy. A copy is both lesser and more than an original. It is lesser because the daguerreotype is in itself unique. It is more because it is portable and repeatable. A copy can travel where an original cannot. A copy can be pinned to a notice board, slipped into a paper, slipped under a teacup where women lean in conspiratorially. The first reproduction of the Dandridge plate would eventually find its way into the Liberty Standard, but not before it changed hands in ways the men who moved it could scarcely have imagined. At Belle-Rive, the weeks proceeded with an unsteady rhythm. The house staff kept the rooms neat. Alistair continued to sign papers. Catherine continued to arrange the social circuits. Thomas read with a feverish intensity that suggested he was trying to reconcile a new reality with the life that had been mapped for him. Ara carried her grief and her endurance in ways that did not announce themselves to the parlors. Samuel went to the fields and lifted sacks. These ordinary acts of survival are not stage directions, they are the substance of lives. To narrate the past is not to make spectacle of suffering, but to record the tenacity of people who have to proceed even when the world has been unkind. Silas left Douglas's shop with the idea that the plate might be more than a curiosity. Douglas, having made a copy, could have placed it in a drawer and pretended he had seen nothing. Instead, he undertook a small, consequential act. He sent word to his brother Marcus. Marcus Webb's press did not print every scandal. It printed stories that fit into a cause. When the image arrived in Philadelphia, when Marcus placed it next to a column that spoke, not politely but plainly, of the realities of slavery, it gained a public life. But public life for an image is not a moral verdict in and of itself. An image becomes public only when persons decide to make it so. Each person on the chain, Silas, Douglas, Marcus, had their reasons, mixed and human. Each decision carried risk. To publish an image that implicated a slaveholding family could invite retaliation, legal threats, community fury. Yet the image's capacity to pierce denial was irresistible to some. The Liberty Standard printed the reproduction and ran it to a readership prepared to see photographs as evidence and to use them in moral argument. Inside the Dandridge's parlor, There was no way, at first, to anticipate the speed of paper and gossip. Scandal is a slow burn until someone reads a newspaper out loud at a tea, and then it is rapid combustion. News in antebellum Virginia moved by carriage and by the mouths of women who stitched the world together with conversation. Merry circulation networks and intimacy lines meant that a printed image, once distributed, could be folded into social life like a rumor with teeth. The first ripple that reached Belle Reve came not from a burning cross of outrage, but from a more penetrating social current, the polite public shrinking that comes with exposure. People who had supped under the Dandridge's chandeliers began to measure distances. Invitations were delayed. Letters arrived dry and brief. Catherine tightened her jaw and measured the cost. How, she asked, to keep a household whole when an image refused to obey the conventions that had long contained such troubles? Evelyn withdrew into a private fortress of shame and grief. Not everyone reacts to exposure with fury. Some retract into a protective silence, as if the shame can be contained within one's person. The plate, however, had become something else. A tool. The Liberty Standard's readers in the North saw the plate and recognized not only one family's secret, but a pattern. The picture made it hard to maintain the neat conceptual walls between white and black that the Southern social order required. If a planter's blood could show in his enslaved man's face, then the language of race that undergirded enslavement required a different explanation. The photograph did not end slavery. It did not by itself create laws, but it made a lie harder to maintain without looking deliberately blind. Back in Petersburg, Marcus Webb received a copy of the plate that would soon cross into public discourse. He compared the faces and understood immediately the rhetorical force the image might wield. Papers did not simply report facts. In this moment, they curated what people could and could not see. For abolitionists, visual evidence carried the kind of blunt force needed to sway public opinion among readers who were far removed from the plantation's private mechanisms. Marcus believed, in his own way, that showing was a form of justice. At Belle Reve, the social machinery of denial was for now strained but not yet broken. The Dandridges met in small private consultations and tried to decide, conceal, confront, or cut loose. Catherine argued for removal, sell the source of the problem, move them beyond reach. Alistair, when pressed, remembered a promise. He had offered in some fashion privately not to sell Ara or Samuel. Promises, even when made by men of their status, carry complicated moral weights. He had the power to keep or to break that pledge. The plate made the choice visible. This is the point at which the narrative tilts toward confrontation. The plate, with its small, unblinking gaze, had exposed the fact of resemblance. The decisions that followed would be a mixture of petty calculation and, for some, moral struggle. The image did not legislate the Dandridges' future. It made possible a different set of choices. It forced them to decide whether to continue living in the curated fiction they had constructed, or to admit a truth that would reshape their lives. Silas, Douglas, and Marcus had played their parts as purveyors of an image. The image itself had no ethics. It only revealed. People would bring their ethics, their worries, and their ambitions to that revealedness. At the moment the plate left Silas's wagon and arrived at Douglas's counter, the world turned imperceptibly. There was no thunderclap. There was a steady accumulating pressure that behaved like weather. The weather cooled the room in which the Dandridges' decisions would be made. The plate's journey had only just begun. It had moved from the dark of a wagon to the light of a shop. It would soon cross the Atlantic of public opinion and ride on newsprint into drawing rooms and tea parlors. For some lives, that spreading light would be a salvific revelation. For others, it would be a ruin. For Ara and Samuel, whose daily experience was survival and small resistances, the coming storm held both danger and the slimmest possibility of relief. There are moments in history that require looking hard. This is one of them. The image demanded it, and the people who held it had to decide how far they were willing to go with that demand. The decision of a traveling photographer to keep a plate, the hands of a printer to reproduce it, the editorial judgment of a publisher to print it, Each was a small lever that, together, would upset lives. The question then expands beyond mere likeness. What happens when a community that has organized itself around denial must look at what it has already done? The answer would arrive slowly, in conversations, in confrontations, in a tea parlor where the Liberty Standards reproduction would be passed hand to hand. But that public moment was not yet upon the Dandridges. The plate was still in circulation beneath the towns that fringed the Dandridges' life, and the house waited with a brittle patience for the thing that would force its hand. The first of many small choices had been made. An image was kept rather than destroyed. That single act was enough to set the rest of the story in motion. The plate moved outward, and the world, in its own uneven tempo, began to rearrange itself around that movement. Once Douglas Webb had made a copy and sent it north to Marcus, the image acquired an architecture of momentum that rumor alone could not have built. Newspapers in the north read photographs as arguments. In a region where most readers would never step onto a plantation, a reproduced likeness served as a window, an incontrovertible invitation to imagine what had previously been cast aside as hearsay. Marcus placed the reproduction alongside a short essay in the Liberty Standard that did not invent facts, but presented them starkly. Here was a likeness that complicated the tidy categories the South depended upon. The paper's language was careful where it needed to be, moral in tone but documentary in claim, and readers who had long debated slavery on abstractions were forced, for a moment, to reckon with a face. Copies traveled with surprising speed. Men carried them folded among letters. A dispatch rider sent one to a friend in Richmond. A ship's purser might stash a sheet amid bills. Women at needlework circles would sometimes tuck a clumsy reproduction under a teapot. The photograph moved like a rumor, but with heft. It could be held, examined, compared in ways words could not be. The plate that Silas had salvaged in a wagon outside Belle-Rive had given millions of private suspicions a public gravity. Word of the Liberty Standards piece reached Tidewater in a roundabout way. A visiting friend mentioned the paper's pictures during a dinner in Norfolk. A trader returning from Philadelphia spoke in the tavern of an ugly engraving. An acquaintance of Beatrice Caldwell, a Norfolk cousin with an appetite for social spectacle, clipped a copy and set a plan in motion. Gossip in the elite circles was not merely idle chatter. It was currency, and Beatrice had the skill of a banker at converting scandal into social capital. She saw in the reproduction a social opportunity. A salon could be a forum of judgment, a tea a tribunal where reputations were publicly passed. The day of the tea was a portrait of polite cruelty. The Caldwell parlor was arranged with a precision that suggested both hospitality and display. Silver tongs set on doilies, a servant's footfall softened, lace like a border framing earnest faces. Beatrice, practiced at producing moments, had arranged for a reading aloud of the Liberty Standards item. Women leaned forward with a mixture of curiosity and a private satisfaction that comes with the chance to witness another person's fall. The reproduction, brittle from being copied again and again, passed hand to hand across the room. It rested under palms and was angled into the lamplight. Eyes compared the printed faces the way people compare pedigree and plate. For the Dandridges, the tea became the turning point from private risk to public ruin. Catherine, who had been bristling with a pragmatic cruelty for weeks, saw the image proffered like proof of inevitability. Evelyn, whose grief had been an inward collapse until that moment, suddenly felt a public pressure she could not contain. The women who had accepted invitations to mean things by polite manners were not all vengeful, but the social eddy from Beatrice's drawing room would ripple outward faster than the family could stanch it. Invitations drifted away. Letters that once spoke of weddings and crops began to carry thin politeness. The house at Belle-Rive lost incrementally its social oxygen. At the tea, the photograph functioned not as an object of forensic study, but as a social weapon. People spoke in undertones so that their tones could be translated into rumor. Some offered the standard polite astonishment, others forwarded interpretations that hardened into accusation. What transpired at Beatrice's parlor may be told without gratuitous spectacle. The picture was shown, the article was read, fits of polite shock were performed, and the Dandridge's social map contracted. In a community sustained by networks of advantage, contraction is punishment. It can be worse than legal censure because it removes the scaffolding of everyday life. Inside Bellerive, the family met in stilted consultations. Alistair, who had always framed his actions within a language of propriety and accounts, found himself negotiating not figures, but a conscience that had been exposed as porous. The ledger had not prepared him for a photograph that confronted him with the physical proof of consequences he had long managed quietly. Catherine wanted clear instruments: sell Ara and Samuel, ship them away, sever the evidence. To her, the problem was one of contingency management. Evelyn, who until then had been composed in the rituals of drawing rooms, felt her dignity undercut by the idea that the house's good name could be sullied by what others saw. She left, formally and finally, her rooms of hospitality to be managed by servants, a withdrawal that carried the moral weight of repudiation without the noise of public drama. Thomas's reaction did not entirely fit the polarity of his relatives. He had been trained in polite deference, yet the plate looked like kin, and kin meant something more complicated than a scandal he could sue away. He visited the quarters, not with the triumph of curiosity, but in the hush that often precedes confession. The encounter with Ara and Samuel in their small cabin was delicate and fraught. Ara did not dramatize her pain. She carried the facts of her life as precise instruments of survival. Samuel, now a young man who had shouldered both labor and inherited injury, received Thomas's presence without theatrics. What Thomas saw there, the familiarity of a jawline, the echo of an eye, did not translate easily into the language of his social future. It demanded an ethical accounting. He could have chosen, like Catherine, the expedient route: expel the source of shame, sell the enslaved, and pursue his career with a reborn anonymity. Instead, something else occurred, a decision that was less a single heroic act than a series of small refusals to accept the tidy solutions offered by his family. He used, in the intimate pressure of private appeals, a leverage his education and place allowed. He pressed his father with an insistence that did not rely on noise, but on persistent request. The plate had made the fact visible. Thomas's actions began to translate visibility into obligation. The precise contours of their private conversations are not all known. The record allows only glimpses: a line in a letter, a recollection remembered by a neighbor, a clerk's note of a hand signing a document. Within those constraints, the arc of events becomes clear. Alistair, whose instinct had been to preserve household equilibrium and social standing, signed manumission papers in March 1855. That signature was both an act of legal formality and a begrudging concession to the pressure that image and family discord had created. In the months between the publication and the signing, social exclusion had mounted. The Dandridges had been forced to choose a course that would be visible to the world and recorded in a way that gossip could not erase. Manumission in that hour was not, importantly, the end of risk. In 1855, Virginia, freeing enslaved people did not necessarily leave them safe within the Commonwealth. The law and custom conspired to make freedom for many black people a conditional clause. Manumitted persons often faced requirements to depart the state. They encountered legal obstacles to owning property and to political participation. Their social existence remained precarious. Alistair signed papers and arranged some small provisions, but those legal parchments were an incomplete remedy for the injuries Ara and Samuel had endured. That complexity must be acknowledged. Manumission brought relief and opportunity, but it also forced departure and a new kind of uncertainty. In the diminished dawn of an April morning in 1855, Ara and Samuel left Bellerive. The household watched in a kind of muted rupture. Evelyn already gone into exile of her own making, Catherine embittered and cold, Alistair shaken though masked by administration of affairs, Thomas standing by with the look of a man who had not yet been absolved by the conscious choices he had made. The departure was not a triumph. It was a fragile crossing. They boarded a coach bound for Philadelphia, a city whose streets promised more anonymity and possibility than the confines of Tidewater could offer. They arrived in the north, carrying not only their lives, but also the residuals of a violence that could not be entirely excised by a signature. Philadelphia received them into a network that was both practical and fraught. Marcus Webb's circle, among others, assisted with lodgings and introductions. Ara and Samuel found, in the city's black community and in sympathetic abolitionist networks, people willing to extend charity work, and the difficult kindness of treating them as persons, not property. Yet arrival in a northern city did not erase the scars that belonged to a life of servitude and assault. Employment was the immediate need. Housing, community, and the slow work of reconfiguring identity followed. Samuel found work and, over time, a modest routine that allowed a degree of autonomy. Ara sought the measures of security a woman with her history could assemble in a place that, while comparatively freer, still carried constant threats of prejudice. Back at Bellerive, the house's social life never quite recovered. Invitations thinned and the weight of appearances could not be set back to even. Alistair's name was uttered in fewer salons. Patrons who had once dined at his table found reason to be remote. His social ruin was not spectacular. There were no bonfires of property, no public executions of reputation. It was an attrition, a steady withdrawal of attention that left a man who had once marshaled public affect now reduced to an administrative steward of an estate that had become tarnished in the eyes of his peers. He remained for a few years in the farmhouse he had built, but his authority had been diminished to a smaller orbit of practical management. Alistair's death in 1859 closed the chapter in a manner consonant with the story's tone. Not theatrical, but unambiguous. He died with the house still standing and a reputation dimmed, neither denounced by law nor forgotten by memory. The estate continued under different hands of social accountability and the slow rhythms of agricultural seasons. For Thomas, the aftermath of the scandal and his father's death opened a longer period of moral labor, not mere atonement in rhetorical terms, but the practical adjustments of a man trying to align his household with a new standard of humane practice. He did not become a saint overnight. He did not erase what had been wrought under his family's authority, but he instituted gradual changes, the offering of wages where they had not existed, more humane treatment for laborers who remained on the property, and a cautious effort to prevent the kinds of abuses that had been so plainly exposed. Those gestures did not erase the system that had enabled such abuses. They were instead a set of small corrective steps that acknowledged responsibility without promising a full moral redemption. Thomas lived with the knowledge that his ease had been built in part on others' suffering. In the quiet rooms of his later life, the photograph, the copies that still circulated in abolitionist pamphlets and in private hands, was for him a constant rebuke. He could not unsee what had been shown, and he acted in measures proportionate to the leverage and influence he possessed. Silas Croft, who had first made the decision that sent the plate into motion, carried a different burden. When the plate's copies had begun to appear in abolitionist journals and in rumor-hungry parlors, he understood that the origin of the image placed him in a precarious position. There was talk of reprisals and of Southern anger toward those who had publicized the intimacy of slaveholders' transgressions. Silas feared not only for his reputation, but for the direct danger that could fall upon him as a man who had preserved the evidence. That fear, mingled with a craftsman's weariness, eventually led him to destroy the original daguerreotype plate. He scraped and scoured as a man would, who wanted to remove the physical thing that had provoked so much turbulence. Mercury and silver, once burned and dealt with, can be erased in their own harsh way. But destroying one original did not erase all traces. Copies, once distributed, had proliferated. The Liberty Standard's reproductions remained in circulation, passed from hand to hand and pasted into scrapbooks and folders. Some abolitionists framed a reproduction as a rhetorical exhibit. Some private collectors kept it as evidence. Some used it in pamphlets to argue the relationship between power and abuse. An image, once it has been seen, changes the behavior of those who see it. In the years that followed, the reproduction became a small emblem in the broader movement against slavery. Not because it converted the entire nation overnight, but because it provided a concrete, visual example that abolitionists could point to when they argued that the system carried within it the contradictions it tried to hide. The photograph's symbolic life took on different valences depending on who held it. For northern readers of the Liberty Standard, it was evidence that forced a moral choice. For the Dandridge neighbors in Tidewater, It was a scandal to be contained. For Ara and Samuel, whose lives it had dramatized, it was a complicated object, instrument of doom in one register and instrument of release in another. Their faces, once captured in silver and mercury, were not merely items of public curiosity. They became in some ways the hinges on which a small part of public conscience turned. The long arc of the plate's significance is worth tracing because it exemplifies a broader condition. Slaveholding respectability relied upon a set of social and conceptual barriers, laws, customs, visual codes, that maintained the fiction of separation between the enslaver and the enslaved. Photographs and other forms of evidence had a way of piercing those fences. When the likenesses of bodies that elite society sought to segregate were placed side by side and shown to the public, the very premise of separation became harder to maintain without, as the narrator might put it, a deliberate act of looking away. That act of looking away is crucial to understanding what happened at Belle Reve. For decades, polite society managed dissonance by a combination of silence and arrangement. A picture removed from a parlor, a child sent away, a promise made in whispers. The plate functioned as a disruption of that economy of silence. It removed the plausible deniability the Dandridges had enjoyed. It demanded that people either answer the question of kinship or perpetuate the lie by increasing the violence of concealment. The choices that followed were not dictated by the image but made necessary by it. Some chose to double down on concealment. Others, like Thomas, chose to leverage what they had to secure a modicum of justice. In the years after Ara and Samuel's departure, their story remained a quiet, persistent note in certain circles. Abolitionist pamphlets referenced their manumission as evidence of moral possibility, and a handful of Philadelphia acquaintances recorded that Samuel found steadier work in the city's labor markets, while Ara took up domestic employment within black households and assisted in community mutual aid. They rebuilt, slowly and under pressure, lives that had been severely constrained. Their existence in the North was not free of hardship. Prejudice and legal ambiguity continued to pose threats. Yet within the particularities of a city like Philadelphia, they found a degree of community and a capacity to survive on their own terms. Meanwhile, the broader implications of the plate lingered in public memory. Newspapers and pamphlets used reproductions as rhetorical tools. Abolitionist speakers pointed to photographs as irrefutable counters to the sanitizing narratives the South promoted. The photograph's capacity to disturb the neat arrangement of racial mythology made it an emblem in a long campaign. It was cited in sermons and in editorials. It was used to challenge men who defended slavery on grounds of lineage and natural order. Visual evidence does not function in a vacuum. It combines with testimony, law, and moral argument, but its bluntness proved useful. Where words could be minimized, an image offered a clarity that made denial harder. The plate story also served as a small case study in the ethics of evidence. Who decides what to show, who benefits, and who is endangered when a private fact becomes public? Marcus Webb and his colleagues believed the moral imperative to expose outweighed the risks of scandal. They judged correctly in some respects that the public good of revealing hypocrisy could drive political pressure for change. But that calculus is never simple. Ara and Samuel were at the center of a moral debate they had not solicited. They bore consequences they did not seek. The plate's circulation salvaged a measure of life for them, manumission, and a chance at self-making, but it also exposed their names, their faces and their past to public readership, and to the prying attention that accompanies notoriety. Those tensions, of public benefit against private cost, are part of the photograph's afterlife. Abolitionists, publishers, and reformers embraced the image because it served a cause. Southern gossips weaponized it because it could wound reputation. Ara and Samuel navigated the consequences with a stoicism born of necessity. The photograph did its work as evidence. People did the rest. In the long view, the Dandridge story became one thread among many, in a culture that was beginning, slowly and not always honestly, to be unsettled by the visual documentary. Photography then, in its adolescence as a medium, proved over the following decades to be a new form of testimony that could not be easily wished away. Portraits and reproductions appeared in courtrooms, in reformist pamphlets, in family albums. The medium's power lay not only in its technical capacity to reproduce faces, but in its cultural function as a truth-teller of a certain kind. Imperfect, subject to bias, but for many observers, harder to dispute than a simple assertion. By the time the Civil War transformed the legal landscape of slavery in America, the plate's immediate scandal had been folded into larger national convulsions. The image itself receded in the daily attention of the public, traded for fresher outrages and new heroes. Still, in abolitionist archives and in private boxes, copies persisted. Historians and activists years later would point to the Dandridge plate as an instance where photographic truth had interrupted polite falsehood. What then finally does this single object teach us? It teaches that seeing is not a neutral act. The photograph did not speak. People did. Its power derived from the choices of men like Silas, Douglas, and Marcus, who decided what to preserve and what to share. It derived also from the unwillingness of some, like Catherine and Beatrice, to accept an ethical cost for social standing. The image's truthfulness forced decisions to hide, to harm, or to help. Those decisions in turn refracted into the lives of Ara and Samuel, into the decline of Alistair, and into the uneasy reform attempted by Thomas. The title that opened this account, How One Photograph Revealed the Slave's Hidden Identity, is not melodrama so much as a compressed description of what a photograph can do in a culture arranged by denial. The plate at Belle Reve was a lens through which a particular injustice was made visible. That visibility was not in itself justice. It was a provocation, a small relentless insistence that a community look. What followed were ordinary human acts in response, some generous, some cruel, and the complicated mess left in their wake. In the end, the plate's legacy is both moral and evidentiary. It stands as an early example of how visual evidence could be marshaled in service of political change, and as a reminder that truth-telling can carry costs to the vulnerable, even as it undermines the structures that harm them. Ara and Samuel's manumission and northward journey represent relief tempered by precarity. Alistair's social decline and death-mark consequence without spectacle, Thomas's partial attempts to repair, reflect a begrudging acknowledgement of responsibility rather than absolution. Silas's destruction of the original plate and the continued circulation of copies show the limits of erasure once something has been seen and disseminated. There are, finally, larger questions that the plate invites us to consider even now. What are the responsibilities of those who capture and circulate images of injustice? How do we weigh the public good of exposure against the private costs to those depicted? How does visual evidence alter moral imagination? Those are questions without single answers. They ask us, however, to remember that evidence is composed not merely of material objects, but of human choices about what to reveal and what to conceal. The daguerreotype at Belle Reve was a sliver of silvered copper that refused to lie. The world around it did not instantly become honest, but the photograph did what it could. It made a likeness undeniable, and through that insistence, it forced a community, fragile in its certainties and thin in its charitable imagination, to look. Some people stumbled toward justice, others toward preservation of standing. The costs were borne in different registers by those with the least capacity to bear them. If this story leaves you with questions, that is part of its purpose. History does not tidy itself into simple moral equations. It presents evidence, it names consequences, it records choices. The plate that began in a wagon and traveled into newsprint is an instance where seeing became a demand for response. It shows starkly that images can do political work. They can challenge narratives, unsettle respectability, and give the vulnerable a pathway, however narrow, toward freedom. To learn more about the documents and archives that informed this account, please check the description below for source links and recommended reading. If this kind of historical investigation interests you, consider sharing the video respectfully with someone who cares about how images shape moral history.